The Santagata lecture series was established at Bowdoin in 1983, and due to this year's extraordinary circumstances, of course, is being produced by a live stream format for the first time. The series is named for Ken Santagata of the Bowdoin class of 1973, who went on to graduate from Columbia Law School and was an associate at the New York law firm Winthrop Stimson when he tragically died of Hodgkin's disease in 1981, just a few days shy of his 30th birthday. Ken was an incisive thinker who loved novel and challenging ideas. He himself established this lecture series through his will to bring these types of debates and deliberations to campus. Ken was an early proponent of the intellectual progress that comes from competing ideas. A special thank you to Ken's mother, Judge Marie Santagata, and to Ken's close friend and classmate, Alan Christenfeld, who are supporters of this lecture series. Now tonight, we're delighted to welcome to Bowdoin, or at least to Bowdoin-controlled airspace, two highly regarded and experienced political journalists and analysts, Mara Liasson and Jonah Goldberg. Let me introduce them both briefly. First, it's a real pleasure to say hello to Jonah Goldberg, who is the Asness Chair in Applied Liberty at the American Enterprise Institute and a fellow at the National Review Institute. He spent more than 20 years at National Review magazine, including as senior editor, before leaving that post in 2019 to start a new venture. He hosts the popular podcast The Remnant with Jonah Goldberg and has written 3 books since 2008, including Liberal Fascism, a #1 New York Times and Amazon bestseller, The Tyranny of Clichés, another bestseller which earned favorable comparisons to P.J. O'Rourke's Parliament of Whores, which is high praise indeed, and most recently, Suicide of the West, How the Rebirth of Tribalism, Populism, Nationalism, and Identity Politics is Destroying American Democracy. Jonah's written for a wide range of outlets, including the Times of London, the American Enterprise, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, even Food and Wine. He was a long-standing CNN contributor, currently a Fox News contributor, and a frequent guest on other networks as well. And not for nothing, his family includes 2 dogs and 2 cats, one of which is the good cat, the other of which is his wife's cat. Welcome, Jonah. Thank you for being with us.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
And we're also delighted to have with us Mara Liasson, a familiar voice to millions of National Public Radio listeners. She's worked at NPR since 1985 as a reporter, newscaster, Congressional correspondent from 1989 to 92, White House correspondent for all 8 years of the Clinton administration, and since then as national political correspondent. If you were up early enough, you will have heard her today on NPR's Morning Edition, even as the sun rose. She's also a political analyst for Fox News Channel, a regular panelist for Special Report with Brit Humes and for Fox News Sunday. She's covered every presidential election since 1992 and has won the White House Correspondents Association's Merriman Smith Award for daily news coverage 3 separate times. She also received a Knight Fellowship in Economics and Business Journalism to study at Columbia University. Prior to joining NPR, Mara was a radio and television reporter in California. She served as editor and anchor of California Edition on California Public Radio, but I'm glad to say her journalism career started here on the East Coast as a print journalist for the Vineyard Gazette in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Again, a very warm welcome. Thank you, Mara, for being here.
Happy to be here.
As we get started, I want to remind viewers that they can email questions during the program to Jim Adolph here at Bowdoin. That address is jadolf, Jadolf, at bowdoin.edu. Again, Jadolf at bowdoin.edu. Received some questions in advance as well. I'll do my best to work in as many as I can. I would promise you that your question will be answered, but we're about to talk about politicians, and maybe it's better not to make promises in an election year. So, with that, let's set the stage if we could with a broad leadoff question for each of you, really. How would you briefly assess the state of campaign 2020, 6 weeks and 1 day before November 3rd? Mara, do you want to take that first?
Sure, I'll take it first. I just want to say I'm thrilled to be here. I spent a lot of weekends in my freshman year of college at Bowdoin. I took the bus from Brown. I had a boyfriend at Bowdoin. I loved visiting Brunswick. Also, I'm happy to be here with Jonah. We often sit on the panel together on Fox. So I'm happy to do this, and it's an amazing election. My take on it is that this has been one of the most static elections I've ever covered. Many, many months ago, like 6 to 9 months ago, large numbers, pluralities of voters told pollsters that they'd already made up their minds and they weren't going to change. And it turns out they meant it. Polls have been really static. Joe Biden has had a lead of mid to high single digits in the national popular vote, smaller leads in the important battleground states. This election has remained, at least until now, a referendum on the incumbent. And when you have 10% unemployment, almost 200,000 dead from COVID, racial unrest, that's a hard place for an incumbent to be. Donald Trump has struggled to make it into a binary choice between him and Biden. That's what incumbents in trouble have to do, make it a binary choice and then disqualify your opponent. What I'm up until Friday night when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I would have said that the next event that could possibly change the dynamic of the race were the debates, where Donald Trump would get his opportunity to prove to America that Joe Biden was the senile, out of touch guy that he's been telling people that he is, and Joe Biden would get a chance to prove that he has the men that you need to be president. What does Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death do to the race? We don't know yet. We don't have a whole lot of polling. I think it does offer Donald Trump an opportunity to do a couple of things. Number one, he will confirm someone before election, or at least looks like they're going to. We haven't had the required number of dissenters to stop it. So it gives him a chance to fulfill the 4-decade-long dream of conservative Republicans to cement a durable conservative majority, 6-3, on the court for decades to come. And it also gives him a chance to change the subject. Instead of COVID and his leadership during the pandemic, he gets to talk about judges. It's something that presidents are supposed to do, as opposed to breaking all the norms that Donald Trump does. Let's see if he can take advantage of it. I can tell you that I have not talked to a lot of people on either side who think that the court opening and the court battle, although it's extremely consequential for the country, is going to make that much race. So see what happens, as Donald Trump himself often says.
Excellent. Jonah, you want to pick up on that?
I don't think I heard anything from Mara, which doesn't surprise me, that I disagree with. I would add that, one of the reasons we are in the place that we're in is that, with the possible exception, Mara can correct me, or actually you can too, possible exception of maybe Andrew Jackson, we do not have presidents who, once they get elected, govern as if they only care about their base. Normally, a president tries to at least pretend that he's the president of the whole country, that he cares about everybody, and he tries to expand his coalition beyond the voters that got him elected. And Donald Trump has not been doing that for virtually the entirety of his presidency, which is one of the reasons why we keep talking about how he's got this irreducible base that will support him no matter what. He's at 40 plus or minus no matter what, and it's been so durable throughout his presidency, despite whatever he may do. And the flip side of that is that if you've got a durable group of people who are immune to changing their minds about the president, there's also the 60% who are also immune to changing their minds about the president, and they're the majority. And so that's one of the reasons why Biden's lead, I think, is so stable, is that it's very difficult not to have an opinion about Donald Trump at this point in American life. And people have made up their minds about the guy. And so going into an election, you'd rather have 60 than 40, with the proviso or the caveat that it is still very much tighter in these battleground states. And I don't know any political analyst who seriously thinks, at least prior to this, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg news, thinks that there's a chance that Trump could actually win the majority of the vote in 2020. But he does have a very plausible, not necessarily likely path to winning the Electoral College again. which means everything will get uglier after the election if he wins in terms of these pushes to get, rid of the Electoral College and all these other things, and we'll have another president elected without a majority mandate from the American voters, which has its problems. I'm a supporter of the Electoral College, but this is not an ideal scenario. Beyond that, I would agree entirely with Mara that until the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I would have assumed the only thing that could really change the course of things was the debates. But I also think that I understand this is almost a semantic peeve. One of my great frustrations with the way people report on the race and people talking about it is that they talk about until election day. Well, election day was about a week and a half ago. That's when it started. It just happens to be that we're on sort of like Jupiter's version of a day, and there are some 40 odd Earth days to the election. There are a couple dozen, a dozen or so states that are already voting, and that means whenever there's a fluctuation in the news, someone could be filling out their ballot right now and saying, "Okay, I'm done with the guy," or "Okay, I'm going to vote for the guy," and that's just very hard as a matter of analysis to figure out how that plays out. We've never been in that kind of situation before.
Yeah. Coming back to your, sorry, Mara, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and we're not going to, we might not even have a result on election day. Not only has election day already started, and it's like Jupiter days or dog years, whatever you want to call it, we might not have an answer to who won the election on election night. We might have election week or election month. But, just to reiterate something that Jonah said, which I think is really important. Donald Trump's, believes in the politics of division, not addition. And his strategy has been described as a strategy of depth. Just dig down deeper, find more people who look exactly like his base voters, white non-college evangelicals, who didn't vote in 2016, and try to get them to turn out. Joe Biden's strategy is a strategy of breadth. He has a big coalition. He's trying to keep it together. And one of the most significant things about modern politics is that the Republican Party, I would argue, Jonah probably has plenty to say about this, has ceased to be a coalition party. And I think that politics in America are their most stable and productive when both parties are coalitions. But we've only got one party that's a coalition. The coalition that used to be the Republican Party, I think, was dealt perhaps a mortal blow in 2018 when that connection between white, rural, non-college voters, evangelicals, and suburban voters was broken. I don't know if it can be put back together again. There's nothing in the polls right now that suggests it can. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, well, I want to circle back to that because I think the party coalitions, whether they're factions or more unified, sort of mini sovereigns that have allied for the convenience of the election. I do want to come back to that. I did want to just note to Jonah's point that, this administration has done bad things to the quantitative study of the presidency. There's no variation in his approval ratings, for example, and very little shift, as we've seen in the polls. I did look up the Real Clear Politics polling average this morning, and this is for the last 2 weeks. It has Biden up 6.5 points across its poll of polls. And that's bounced around a little bit, but on March 9th, this is the week before President Trump declared a national emergency over the COVID pandemic, that figure was 6.5 points, right? In fact, at the end of October 2019, a year ago, before impeachment and COVID and protests and riots and the federal reaction to all of that, again, that margin was 6.3 points, right? And again, it's bounced around a little, but it has been remarkably stable. And that, again, does bad things for the forecast of presidential elections, which rely on things like shifts in approval or the economy for that matter. But, gives us obviously a lot of scope for debate about the kind of governance strategy the president's followed. So just to chat a little bit about turnout and interest in the election. As Jonah mentioned, the election started in certain ways. There will be people for whom any kind of October surprise is too late, right? No matter how surprised they may be, their vote is now cast. But we're seeing obviously very high levels of interest in the election. Even in 2018, we had more than 50% turnout, which was well above historical averages for a midterm election, actually the highest since 1914. which was before women could vote, and indeed a higher percentage than voted in the 1996 presidential election. So just wanted to get your thoughts on what that might mean. We hear a lot about differential enthusiasm, that Biden people really aren't enthusiastic. You certainly see, Trump rallies. He's desperate to get back to the people who want to see him and hear him and be with him. Whereas, of course, Joe Biden has had a much more sort of hands-off strategy. I don't know if you think the Biden in the basement trope has any traction moving forward. But generally, how does the question of turnout break in this election?
I'll jump on it first. I think that part of the argument that you'll hear from Trump people is this thing about how there's not as much enthusiasm for Biden. That means Biden can't get out his base. And that always seemed to me to be mistaken, because the person who is going to galvanize Joe Biden's base is Donald Trump. There is an enormous negative partisanship factor here. And I think negative partisanship or negative polarization, whatever you want to call it, is the defining feature of our politics these days. And all negative polarization is the idea that there are millions of Republicans who vote Republican because they hate Democrats, and there are millions of Democrats who vote Democrat because they hate Republicans. Jonathan Rauch has some fantastic data about this, about how strict partisans, the bases of each party, actually don't like their own parties that much. They just hate the other party more. I have this, I'll show it to you later, but I have this poster on my wall. It's a cartoon from the New Yorker that my wife had blown up for me for a birthday present a few years ago. And it has two dogs sitting at a bar. One's drinking a martini, one's drinking a beer. They're wearing suits. And one dog says to the other, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. And that attitude is really a big driver in our politics. The place where I think that the enthusiasm factor for Trump actually is an advantage for Trump is what Mara was getting at earlier, which is there are an enormous number of non-voters out there who are white, college, non-educated. And if you can scoop deeper into that sort of reserve army of voters that don't really show up in polls and that don't show up in a lot of models of the electorate, then that enthusiasm factor can really be an advantage for Donald Trump. It just depends where they are, what states, and whether or not the Trump campaign can in fact get them to the polls, or to the mailboxes.
I actually think, first of all, they happen to live in the places that matter. White non-college voters decrease as a percentage of the electorate by 2 points every cycle. But in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, they're still 57 to 60% of the electorate. So they happen to live in the places that matter. That's how Donald Trump got elected in the first place.
Right.
I remember talking to people like Bill Frey, the demographer, saying, oh, no, there's just not enough white non-college voters out there for Trump to pull it off. Well, yes, there were. And this time, we are led to believe he has very sophisticated social media, data mining kinds of tools to go find them. They do live in the same media ecosphere, conservative media ecosphere, as his supporter, as the people who did turn out for him. So he should be able to find them. But polls do not reflect don't indicate that he is finding them. Now, what Jonah was mentioning is last time they were missed. The models that pollsters used didn't have enough white non-college voters in them. Supposedly that's been corrected. Every pollster you talk to says they've corrected for that. The other thing that's happening, which is really interesting, is that Donald Trump won with the same percentage of the vote that Mitt Romney got and lost. So what happened is that Democrats didn't turn out. They weren't excited about Hillary Clinton. This time, Democrats are extremely enthusiastic, as Jonah said, to vote against Donald Trump, not necessarily for Joe Biden, but he'll take it any way he can find it. And the other thing that's really interesting is Joe Biden has made inroads with white voters, white seniors, non-college women. Those were groups that Donald Trump won with big time. And that's where Biden has made has had some success. He is doing a little bit worse than Hillary did with Latinos, but he's making up for it with seniors and with white non-college women. This was the value of nominating an old white guy from Scranton.
If we think about the
reflect the Democrats' modern coalition or base.
Well, so obviously the vice presidential nominee, Senator Harris, is designed to make up for some of that at least.
Right.
And presumably, the effort will be to stir up, turnout by people of color in those key states that did not come out for Hillary Clinton in 2016. There was, I think Jonah mentioned the use of data, or somebody mentioned data, sort of get out the vote techniques. Something that the Trump campaign really didn't seem to care much about in 2016. Hillary Clinton talked about all her field offices, et cetera. And then, of course, the trope became that she didn't go to Wisconsin, and that was what doomed her. So again, given the constraints of the coronavirus, we're not going to see the same kind of ground game that we see in a normal election. I guess, is that going to matter? What are people doing on the ground to get out the vote at this point?
Well, the Trump campaign has been knocking on doors. The Biden campaign hadn't been, but is now starting. And a lot of state Democratic parties are starting to do that. A lot of texting, a lot of cell phones, it's just different. The ground game is different. Not a lot of people want to open their door to somebody who knocks on their door. But there's no doubt that this is a turnout election because the slice of the electorate that's up for grabs and open to persuasion is so tiny, anywhere between 5 and 10%.
Yeah, I would just add, I remember writing a column during the primaries for the LA Times arguing that that Joe Biden should be running a front porch campaign back then because he's not. I think what the Trump, Donald Trump and the Trump campaign talks about Joe Biden being, mentally unfit, doesn't know he's alive. I think all of that is pretty grotesque and over the top and norm busting and all that. But I do think he's kind of missed a step, and he's showing his age. And one of the weird things about the pandemic is that it is almost perfectly designed for a front porch style campaign where he can sit on his lead a little bit, let Donald Trump be out in front and step on his own messaging all of the time and all that, at least prior to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And that is why, we were saying earlier that we thought the debates could be a game changer because there is this historic tendency long before Joe Biden was a 70-something-year-old that Joe Biden he just says strange things, right? I mean, you never know. There's a non-trivial chance that he's going to start shouting, "Get these squirrels off of me" at any random moment. And that, I think, terrifies a lot of Biden people. But if he can control his messaging, he's this sweet, avuncular guy. He won the primaries not by appealing to the radical base or anything like that, but by winning fairly small C conservative African-American women in places like South Carolina, or over, who are middle-aged or over. And that's a very stable base. It doesn't it doesn't chase Twitter around. It doesn't get caught up in the sort of the latest, cable news hysteria. And so Biden, I think, is actually pretty well placed in all of this for his voters to just show up and vote without needing a lot of sort of hype and galvanizing the way they might in another time.
Yeah, look, they voted for him in the primary without him having a campaign. I mean, right. The thing that was amazing about the primary was he had no money, he had no field organization. So after South Carolina, when Black voters gave him the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, all of a sudden, en masse, Democratic voters moved to Biden. Why? They hadn't seen any ads from him. They hadn't gotten a door knock from one of his volunteers because he hadn't really no campaign infrastructure. They did this. They looked at Bernie. They looked at Biden. They said, who can beat Trump? And it was an extremely rational kind of head over heart kind of choice. And I thought it was really mature. It showed the Democratic voters were willing to make a very cerebral choice. And they heaved what I don't want to call it crappy, but a not so great politician over the finish line. Usually it's the opposite. Usually there's a candidate by dint of their incredible talents and their grit and perseverance that heaves a crappy campaign over the finish line. We saw Bill Clinton do that. But this was the opposite. Democratic voters picked Biden up and carried him on their shoulders and gave him the nomination. And Jonah is right. Joe Biden is showing his age. And the debates are going to be one of the first chances for large numbers of people to get a look at him in a relatively unscripted situation. He did fine at the convention. He gave a speech where he looked very presidential. But this time, there will be opportunities for him to do the weird things that he does, except that if you look at Biden's history in debates, he doesn't do that in debates. He's very well prepared. He the kind of, when he's relaxed and informal and is talking to a black radio talk show host, that's when he says some weird thing like, you know, if you vote for Trump, you ain't black. Or, you know, something about how, you know, unlike Hispanics, who are not a monolith, black voters always vote Democratic, things like that. I think the chances are less that he's going to screw up in a debate. And the Trump campaign has done him a great favor by lowering expectations so much that if he doesn't drool in his soup on the debate stage, he's going to look like Einstein, which is exactly what Hillary Clinton did for Donald Trump in 2016. You know, she made him out to be such an incompetent, crazy, ill-informed person, which wasn't the guy that a lot of people saw in the debate.
So you talked, Mara, about the fact that a lot of people in the Democratic Party who might not necessarily have been wildly enthusiastic about Biden, nonetheless jumped on board, hoping to beat Trump. I was wondering, you know, the death of Justice Ginsburg has already provoked a lot of people on the left to, you know, they're very angry about the idea that the so-called, you know, the moral principles of 2016 about not filling the seat,
right,
you know, have been jettisoned pretty quickly and not surprisingly. So, you know, there's talk about, you know, DC statehood and expanding the size of the Supreme Court and all kinds of stuff going on. Is it, you know, possible that that's going to provoke sort of a progressive overreaction, lead into, you know, Joe Biden taking positions that he would prefer not to have to take?
Joe Biden is not going to take a position that DC should be a state, or we should pack the court, or we should have 18-year term limits on the court, which, by the way, are things that are going to be discussed in the future, especially if the Democrats get the White House and the Senate back. The whole big debate about minority rule is huge, and it's going to get huger. It's about the Electoral College. It's about a president who hasn't gotten the popular vote. It's about 53 Republican senators representing fewer than 50% of the American population, and most of that chunk is white. That's a big debate, and we're going to have it for years because now Democrats feel the system is patently unfair. It is truly rigged against them structurally. But I think there's always danger for Democrats to overreact. I mean, that is just kind of, that's in their DNA. You know, really defund the police? Like, why? Get rid of ICE? It's so unnecessary. But there's plenty of opportunity for Democrats to overreact. But from my conversations with the Biden campaign, I think he's going to stick to his knitting. He's been very disciplined. He's going to be talking about what a conservative majority means on the court for Obamacare, for healthcare, for DACA, for choice, for voting rights. I think that's what they're going to do. This other debate about what the Democrats do about the court if they ever get back into power and have the Senate is going to be a huge, fundamental, profound debate. But I don't think that Biden is going to take that bait. I see Biden as being remarkably immune right now to the pressures from the left. He moved left. His platform is much more progressive than he'd ever been as a politician. But he doesn't have to move left to win. Even on this court fight. But in terms of what you were talking about, energizing the base, I think, you know, historically Republican voters care about the courts more than Democratic voters because they were on the losing end. Since Roe, they've been on a 4-decade quest to get the majority on the court back. They're finally going to get it this year. Democrats were lazy. They assumed they had the court. Of course, now they are learning that it isn't. But the effect that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death had on young women, young Democratic women, I think is really profound, and it's going to show up at the polls. I've had people tell me that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the motivating force for young voters that Biden could never be. And I do think that that she's going to be an energizing force for Democrats. maybe even more than the final achievement of a conservative majority will be for Republicans. I don't know how big the universe is of Republican voters who care about the court who already weren't going to vote for Donald Trump.
You add to that
Yeah.
in terms of the effect on the Republican base of this vacancy, and of course the the issues that are raised by litigation that's ongoing right now, and that could really make pretty dramatic changes in the American policy ecosphere.
Sure. But since I know this lecture series is supposed to be at least in part a debate, and so far I haven't been able to disagree with Mara on anything, I want to take some bait of my own when she was talking about how the Electoral College is really rigged against Democrats. I know she knows this, and it was just a turn of phrase, but um, I'm a defender of the Electoral College, and it's the phrase that you hear a lot from a lot of people, that it's rigged, that it's sort of national gerrymandering, and all of these kinds of things. First of all, Barack Obama won the Electoral College quite handily, twice. The people talking about how it's this long-standing trend that locks out urban and minority voters never want to concede that it's a trend that has lasted 6 years, and that's not a long-standing trend. Moreover, um, the as recently as 2016, 3.5 years ago, most Democrats were boasting about their blue wall in the Electoral College and how it almost guaranteed them victory in presidential races. And the second it worked against them, they started talking about how it was this anachronistic vestige of to uphold slavery. Well, it's a very weird thing to say that this pro-slavery mechanism was something you were bragging about 3 years ago. I think these predictions about the demographic changes don't take into account how parties react and interact with each other, and coalitions change. We're seeing, Donald Trump, to a lot of people's surprise, doing quite well with Hispanics, at least in Florida. Those kinds of changes can happen too. Anyway, onto the Supreme Court issue. I think Mara is right, getting back to our grand policy of consensus here. I think Mara is right that most of the voters who really passionately care about Donald Trump, care passionately about the court, were already in Trump's column among conservatives. I think for a handful, statistically speaking, a handful of conservatives, it could work one of two ways. One, if Trump gets an appointment before before the election, or at least in this term, right before the next term starts, then there's an argument about, okay, well, he's not going to get any more Supreme Court appointees. We wanted him for the Supreme Court. He got it. Now I don't have to vote for him. Some people might feel that way, but I think if they could dangle the bait and say, this is the reason why you got to vote for him, because you'll get another judge, that does corral some people who are looking for permission to vote for Trump, but they're sort of embarrassed to, or reluctant to. I personally, I'm torn on this. I think the way this is playing out is sort of a terrible thing for the country, and it is going to encourage Democrats to do all sorts of terrible things about, such as court packing and all of that. And I wish we had leaders who could forestall some of that. I just wrote my LA Times column about this, that I wish there was some sort of Gang of Eight kind of deal, that a handful of Republicans would agree to delay the confirmation of a justice in exchange for a handful of Democrats saying they will not vote for any scheme to pack the courts, or maybe even some of the statehood stuff. But it doesn't look like anybody has the intestinal fortitude or the statesmanship to do anything like that. And at the same time, I like Amy Conant, Browning. I think she would be a good Supreme Court justice. I think that this has been the brass ring for conservatives like me for a half century, to get the court to more of a proper function in our politics. And I should say that one of the reasons why these Supreme Court fights are so unbelievably ugly is because of the judicial activism that the court gets involved in. When the court becomes more powerful and more of a legislative force, in effect, than the Congress or the presidency in certain circumstances, then of course we're going to increase the stakes for these things more than ever. The court should not be the central role in our lives and in our politics, but when it lives outside its bounds it attracts this kind of passion from people because the stakes are so high. If we lowered the stakes by the court observing a more traditional understanding of what the court is for, we wouldn't care as much about who's on the court.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, we've had a period of congressional underreach, not overreach, and too much is left to the court. Now, I'm not convinced that a conservative majority wouldn't be just as activist only on the right as a liberal court. But what Jonah is going to be called upon to do in the next couple of years is make the argument that the Electoral College is fair. And that's something that Republicans haven't done yet. I don't know how many elections we can have where the guy who ends up being president got fewer votes than the other guy and have people perceive the system as fair. I don't know how many, 3, 4, 5, but I know that there is a limit to how often we can have the popular vote split from the Electoral College. You know, and have that be the outcome of our elections. I don't think people quite understand that we don't elect our presidents by popular vote. We elect them by state by state, winner take all system. And I think to a majority of Americans, that seems unfair. Now, there are some solutions to this. Of course, there's the popular vote compact that states could pass. There's also my favorite silly solution, which is that some billionaire should fund the Young Person's Homesteading Project, where they offer a down payment on a mortgage to any young person who will move off the coast and move to any swing state anywhere in the country, because Democrats are just inefficiently distributed, you know, in urban areas and on the coast. But this is going to be a huge debate.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Obviously, in 2016, President Trump, you know, if you take out California and New York, then he does win, in fact, a popular majority. California, though, you know, is presumably going to be even more anti-Trump than it was 4 years ago. I do wonder, though, California in 1988, this maybe gets to Jonah's earlier point. In 1988, it was a Republican state. It was part of the famous Republican L that would always win the Electoral College, and that was replaced in pretty short order by the blue wall and by the Democratic lock. So it's an interesting question moving forward, whether the parties can be responsive enough to shift to that. And so that's a question I actually want to ask. I want to make sure we have some time to talk about Congress as well. We haven't mentioned the congressional races much, and we need to at least mention the main Senate race. But on our way to that, Jonah, maybe you would talk about something that Mara raised at the very beginning with regards to the Republican Party and divisions within the party. I mean, we have seen those, you know, the so-called Never Trumpers, the Lincoln Project, other groups that have tried to oppose the president from, I suppose, still within the party. So I wonder if you could talk about that and whether, in fact, you know, with the Middle East Accords, with the new vacancy on the Supreme Court, you know, some of the ways the culture wars have morphed, so-called cancel culture and the like, have those moved people away from Never Trump and back to Trump? Are we seeing that kind of shift?
It's moved some. My AEI colleague, Danielle Pletka, wrote a very controversial op-ed for the Washington Post last week where she said she was moving, and she was basically a Never Trump type. I don't use that term. Once he got elected, I thought the word Never Trump was sort of had lost its usefulness because he was president. My position was I was never going to endorse him, and you know, and I was never going to vote for him. That position has not changed, but I wanted the guy to succeed, and so you get a fresh start as far as I was concerned. That said, I'm very critical of Donald Trump, and I think he's doing lasting damage both to the conservative movement, which I care about vastly more than I care about the Republican Party, and the country, which I care about more than the conservative movement. That said, it was interesting where Mara was saying earlier that the Republican Party is no longer a coalitional party. I take her meaning as, you know, when she was talking about the different sort of components of the GOP coalition falling apart. I think she's absolutely right about that. But as a sort of as an intra-party intellectual matter, the GOP has become more coalitional than it ever was in my life. I always used to argue that, much like, you know, Reagan used to say, you know, if you believe these 7 things out of 10, you're a Republican. It was ideational, while the Democratic Party was coalitional in the sense of it was still holding on to the FDR coalition, which had a very long shelf life. And now there are lots of conservative factions that either support or oppose Trump for various reasons, but most of them support Trump, and they usually do it on a fairly single issue kind of way, or because of negative polarization and they hate the Democrats, or because they do it because it's a cult of personality thing. But among the sort of my crowd of Washington, New York, journalist, think tankers and all of that, the people who are pro-Trump, it's because of judges, or it's because they disliked Hillary. Now there's this rising nationalism on the right, this sort of case for intellectual nationalism, which is throwing overboard all of the fusionism and Reaganism that I grew up on in favor of essentially what I would call a right-wing version of progressivism, where it's a one-size-fits-all vision for how the country should operate. In fact, I would argue that both nationalism and socialism these days are very similar phenomenon in the United States. They are both an attempt to impose a cult of unity and a cult of conformity on the entire country, which is why sort of conservatives like me who still believe in classical liberalism and the right to be wrong can have an easier time talking to liberals and progressives who don't believe in cancel culture of the left any more than I believe in cancel culture of the right. And we can actually have conversations. I mean, for a while, I was like the house goy at NPR, all because I still believed in the old conservatism pre-Trump. And so I think there is this strange movement of roving factions on the intellectual factions on the right that have momentary alliances and then are back at each other's throats. And I think it's going to be that way for a good long while if Trump loses. If Trump wins, I have no idea what happens to the right, and I think you do see a mass exodus of a lot of people who've been trying to stick it out.
Well, I was going to just ask quickly on that front, if in January 21st, 2021, Donald Trump is starting his second term, the frenzy to succeed him within the party is presumably going to start that early, right? So, what are the factions that will be competing then? Do you see certain lanes?
Sure. I think one way you can think of it is there's going to be a nationalist lane, sort of nationalist China hawk kind of lane with Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley being out in front there. There's going to be something of the let's get the old pre-Trump band back together lane, which would be some version of Nikki Haley, Ben Sass, that kind of thing. I honestly think Tucker Carlson, he's an old friend of mine, but we don't exactly see eye to eye on very much anymore. I think Tucker Carlson is eyeing the idea of being the new Pat Buchanan, a media personality who runs to take over the party. And I think there will be a free-for-all, and it'll be interesting to see if Trump wins, at what point and on what issue various representatives of different factions start criticizing him. Oh, and I should also say there's going to be an attempt to claim to be the Trump heir apparent in the form of Mike Pence, which it would take a heart of stone not to laugh at that prospect. Because the idea that Mike Pence can hold on to an auditorium full of MAGA hats the way that Donald Trump can is just laughable. And he'll try, and I just don't think it's going to succeed.
Is there an heir apparent? Sorry, I was just going to say, is there an heir apparent in the actual, in Donald Trump Jr. or something like that?
Yeah, there's Donald Trump. You know what? In terms of figuring out who is the future leader of the Republican Party or what the Republican Party stands for beyond what Trump wants on a given day, I think it will be so much better for the long-term health of the party. They can figure that out much more easily if he's not the president on January 20th. In other words, what Jonah is describing is this process that I would think would be like really interesting and intellectually fruitful if Donald Trump was, somewhere off stage running his own TV network with his cult following than if he's still in office, because he has created this party that's really all about him. And I think the intellectual work and the ideological debate that Jonah's describing is going to be really hard to do while he's in office. A lot of it is happening now, but it's happening at a very kind of subterranean level. And I don't really know how that happens during another 4 years. The other thing is, if he is the president on January 20th, there's a lot of things we don't know. Did he win the popular vote? Probably not. Is he the president because he contested the election? I mean, there's so many things that can happen between now and January 20th. And, we can't even imagine half of them.
Right. Well, obviously the makeup of Congress will matter to some of those discussions since Congress comes in on January 3rd. So I wanted to make sure we did spend a little time thinking about that. Some of the issues we've talked about, for example, Justice Ginsburg's death, are being talked about as if they will inspire different reactions in different states, which could matter for the Senate. So I wonder if you would, Mara, maybe starting with you, just sort of give a sense of the Senate, and of course Senator Collins, maybe with get some
I'll
attention.
talk about that. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the House will remain Democratic. I think that in terms of the Senate races, and a Supreme Court fight always has the most effect on Senate races, just by definition. We saw in after the in 2018, after the Kavanaugh fight, it was a misfire for Democrats. It contributed to losing some of their Senate incumbents in red states. I think in this case, the fight probably hurt Senator Collins. She was already trailing Sarah Gideon. And I think that, having the Supreme Court fight now is not good for her, probably hurts Cory Gardner. But I also think it hurts Democrats like Steve Bullock in Montana. I don't know what it does for Thom Tillis. That's a little unclear to me in North Carolina. It's really interesting to me to see so far we've only had 2 Republicans, Collins and Murkowski, who've said that they want to wait to vote till after Inauguration Day. Everyone else is falling into line. You'd have to have 2 more Republicans say they don't want to vote before November 3rd to stop this, and I just don't see where those two votes would come from.
Jonah?
Yeah, no, I as a rule, I defer to Mara on all issues of congressional punditry. But I think that the prospect of the Republicans holding on to the Senate was not great prior to all of this, and I'm very reluctant to change that opinion, at least so far, because of the Supreme Court news, and which is one of the reasons why I think that there's an incentive structure for Republicans currently in the Senate to figure out some sort of way of handling this that prevents a continuation of this vicious cycle of each side sort of out nuclear optioning the other. But I think, Cory Gardner is for sure in real trouble. He needs to overperform Donald Trump in that state, and I don't see how this helps him get there. And, and the House, I think, is obviously a foregone conclusion at this point.
So the kind of moderation, Jonah, that you're talking about, where you could have a gang of 8, right? That's the kind of thing that Susan Collins has traditionally been at the heart of, right? Obviously, she's been hurt by polarization, generally the fact that there are no sort of moderate votes, right? You take a vote on the Trump side and on the anti-Trump side, and you hope they kind of average out to moderate, but in fact, they just make both sides angry. I mean, is there a prospect for resetting that, or are you just being sort of wistful when you say, I just wish, someone would.
Yeah, no, there's a little wistfulness to it. I'll plead guilty to wistfulness, Your Honor. But, and Mara mentioned, hinted at this earlier when we were talking about the court. The big picture problem with the legislative branch is that the founding fathers never imagined that the legislative branch would not be a jealous guardian of its rights, responsibilities, and prerogatives. And for close to 70 years, the Congress, which is the first branch, this whole idea of co-equal branches is Nixonian propaganda from impeachment. Congress is supreme, and it writes the laws, it raises taxes, it declares war, it can fire members of the other branches. The other branches can't do squat to Congress. It is supreme, and they've doled out their power and the responsibility to other branches and to the bureaucracies. And then what is happening increasingly is that people are behaving as if we live in a parliamentary system, and you just vote for a party, and you expect unified, party loyalty from all of the members, and a lot of these members have internalized that, and they care more about getting hits on Morning Joe or Fox and Friends than they care about actually legislating. And in that environment, someone like Susan Collins is a little antiquated. That makes me sad, but I think that's the fact of it.
Yeah, look, it's almost as if we've had the worst aspects of a parliamentary system without any of the benefits. Now, if the Democrats get back in control and get rid of the legislative filibuster, now we don't know if they're going to let DC or Puerto Rico be a state or pack the courts, but we're pretty sure that they're going to get rid of the legislative filibuster. And that would introduce a kind of parliamentary system into Congress. In other words, the party that wins the majority would be able to pass its program, and it would be accountable for whether that program works or not, or becomes popular or unpopular. That's something we don't have now. You can run on something, you can make all sorts of crazy promises because you know that it's never going to happen. You're just going to go to Congress and be mired in gridlock. So that is a change that I think, look, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, but I would predict that the legislative filibuster is not long for this world.
Well, it's interesting, Jonah, you talked about Congress handing over its authority. I've written about that myself. And it is interesting, this hooks back into a question raised earlier. I'm probably the only person in the audience who wants to talk about administrative law under a more conservative Supreme Court, so I won't go quite there. But, yeah, this question of delegation, would Mara's parliamentary system, shorn of the filibuster, stop delegating? Would it actually take on responsibility for itself, or would it merely hand even more power over to the presidency?
I honestly think it's an open question. I mean, I'm for keeping the legislative filibuster, but one of the advantages of it is they'd be the dogs that caught the car, and they would actually get to be held responsible for the legislation that they pass. And that kind of accountability is healthy in a democracy because, it's as Edmund Burke, the founder of modern conservatism, says, example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other. And what he meant by that is sometimes you just have to show people things. You can't tell them, you have to show them. Or as Ed Koch, who I think said it better when he lost for his third term running for mayor of New York City, he was asked if he were going to run again, and he said, no, the people of New York fired me, and now they must be punished. And I think giving one party or another the power to do what they say they can do creates consequences. Obama got Obamacare, and it turned out to be a disaster for the Democratic Party. One of the things that I find very frustrating is if you watch the Democratic primaries, and both parties are guilty of this, but we didn't have an open primary on the Republican side. Countless of the candidates would get up and say on day one, as Joe Biden said it like a week ago, day one he's going to raise corporate taxes. People, Elizabeth Warren would say, day one I'm going to, go after guns or get rid of this or ban fracking and all of these kinds of things. Our presidents don't have that power in our system. And when you tell people that they do, and then you can't deliver on it, it feeds not only just into feelings of frustration, but into sort of conspiracy theories, because they're never going to say, oh, it turned out I was lying to you. They're going to say I was thwarted by the billionaires or the globalists or somebody like that. And so forcing institutions to actually use the power that they have, that's a silver lining, I think, and would be a good thing.
Let me, Mara, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, I'm going to try to rope in a couple of questions that had come in. I've been trying to do that throughout, but as we're coming down to the half hour here, these don't exactly go together, but maybe they do. So there's one question about swing voters, right? Do they still exist? Is there anybody out there, right, who's actually changing their mind? That's one. And then related to that, we have a question about journalism, actually, which has its own sphere of polarization, perhaps. Mara, you appear on Fox News and NPR. Jonah, you're on Fox also. You write for the LA Times, right? Are you tailoring your messages, is the question, to different audiences? What is the role of your sort of, going into different, I won't say echo chambers exactly, but that word has been used by Ezra Klein and others.
I would just say that Jonah and I are the exceptions that prove the rule about media polarization. The joke is MSNBC and CNN Fox and MSNBC don't even cover the same natural disaster. So the media is as polarized as any other part of American society. but I don't tailor what I say at all. I mean, if you listen to me on NPR or on Fox, I'm saying the same thing. And I would say that when you work for a mainstream news organization, they still exist. Parts of Fox are mainstream, not the opinion shows, but the panel that Jonah and I appear on. To me, that's pretty mainstream. The discussion there is pretty similar to what you'd have anywhere else. In terms of swing voters, I just stated the person who asked the question, yes, they exist. There are just fewer of them this year than in other years, very few undecided. And the estimate of how many people are truly up for grabs or persuadable is somewhere between 5 and 12%. So very, very small.
Yeah, I should also, I agree on the swing voter part. I should also say on the tailoring the message thing, Mara and I also have slightly different job descriptions. I'm a straightforward opinion journalist. I co-run a media outlet, The Dispatch. But in my columns and in my punditry, I just follow the rule of I say what I believe to be true. And one of my great frustrations in the Trump era is I just know for a fact that there are a good number of people who are in the same line of work as I am, with the same job description, who do not say what they know to be true. One of the reasons I think right-wing media and left-wing media, including lots of mainstream media, are in big problems is in part because I think the parties have become so weak and so emaciated and so hollowed out that large swaths of the mainstream media, large swaths of progressive and conservative media have taken up the baton and they're doing party work by proxy. And I'll admit, I sometimes I'll save a certain kind of column and not try to put it into the LA Times just because the headaches and the feedback I get from LA Times readers is like opening the Ark of the Covenant to the end of Indiana Jones, and I don't need it. But I won't say things that I don't believe to be true to that audience. But the idea that I cater my opinions or what I say is kind of funny, given that I used to be on Fox News about 5 times a week, give or take. I'm on maybe twice a month now because I don't fit in that sort of schema that all the television cable networks use, which is if you're a conservative, you're supposed to be supporting the Republicans and attacking the Democrats. And if you're a liberal, you're supposed to be supporting the Democrats and attacking the Republicans. And I don't really fit in that box in the Trump era. And so I just don't make sense in that space. And it's cost me considerably professionally to sort of stick to my guns like that. So I have the right to brag about it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any theme that runs through this discussion, it's how all these institutions, little d democratic institutions that we need to be strong and functioning are kind of withered. Like Congress has pretty much abdicated, the parties aren't strong and are kind of shells of their former selves. All of these things, we need a civic revival in this country that could start with civics education, actually, K through 12, so people actually understand what these institutions are supposed to do. But it took a long time for us to get here. I think Donald Trump really accelerated this process because he kind of, breaks a norm, throws one overboard almost every day. But that's why we're at where we're at with this, polarization tearing us apart, and people, not willing to compromise at all.
Well, let's wrap up maybe with one question. We started with the stability of the race. I wonder if each of you could make the sort of the best substantive case for the president's reelection at this point, and the likelihood of its occurring. With again 43 days until Election Day, or though to remind people, Election Day has started. It's election month. So, I mean, I guess it's maybe the substantive case and the political case for his reelection as we enter the home stretch.
Well, if he is reelected, he will have convinced the country that the pandemic is in the rearview mirror, that he is the guy to pick up the economy where he left off right before the pandemic, that Joe Biden is weak and a Trojan horse for the left. I mean, if he can succeed in doing all those things, he'll be reelected. It's hard to defeat an incumbent. Very few of them, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush, I think the only two in the modern era. But that would be the case for his reelection. And also, I think it would prove that a lot of the polls that we're seeing, since we haven't seen Donald Trump have a lead in almost any battleground state or national poll, are simply wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, that's the best case that the Trump team has, is that Biden's not up to the job, and the real power centers of the Democratic Party are much more radical than him. And I mean, of all of the gas that Kamala Harris could have had to say in the Harris administration with the help of Joe Biden was about as bad as you could do. And I think that the other part of it is that I don't want to get all Marshall McLuhan here when we're over time, but part of it is that I think a lot of people have priced in Donald Trump's behavior and the sort of reality showness of it, and it's sort of like a soap opera where you hate some of the characters but you love to hate them. And I think there's a real problem with the resistance crowd being addicted to Trump obsession, and there's a real problem with obviously the cult of personality on the right for Trump. But there are a lot of, I think you could see just a lot of voters saying, well, this is the new normal. I kind of think it's funny. I'm going to move on to it. I think that's a terrifying prospect, but I think subliminally, I think it's part of Trump's advantage, is that, we no longer freak out that he tweets like an escaped monkey from a cocaine study. It's normal, right? And I think that has seeped into the culture a great deal, and that sort of reality show feel could help him get reelected as well.
Great. Well, as my grandmother said about almost everything, time will tell. But we are unfortunately out of time tonight. I do want to thank our guests. Again, we're so delighted that you were able to join us tonight, Mara Liasson and Jonah Goldberg. We really hope we'll be able to welcome you physically up to campus at some time in the very near future. We would love to see you here in beautiful Brunswick. And we hope that everyone out in the audience is thinking about these issues, is going to get engaged, will be living up to their duties as a citizen this election season and well beyond. So with that, again, thanks to our panelists, thanks to you, the audience, and thanks to the Santagata family for sponsoring this lecture series. I'm Andy Rudalevige. Good night.